Yebohn, Berlin, January 16, 1945. 9 meters below the ruined garden of the Reich Chancellery, a steel door swings shut with a sound like a bank vault sealing for the night. Above ground, the city still stands. Battered but recognizable, its grand ministries pockmarked with shrapnel scars but still functioning after 5 years of war. Down here, in a corridor barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, the air already carries the particular smell of a place built never to be opened to daylight. Diesel fumes drifting from the generator room, damp concrete that never quite cures in the enclosed atmosphere, and the faint metallic tang of recycled air pushed through narrow ventilation shafts disguised among the shrubbery above. Adolf Hitler has just taken up what will become permanent residence in what is, within 4 months, to be the last functioning headquarters of the Third Reich. He will not leave this complex alive. Around him, a strange compressed world is taking shape. A map room where the positions of armies that no longer meaningfully exist are still tracked with colored pins moved by aides reluctant to report otherwise. A telephone switchboard connecting to a Reich disintegrating province by province, and, somewhere along the maze of small partitioned rooms, a dog kennel for an Alsatian named Blondi. Secretaries type letters in a space with no natural light and no reliable sense of day or night beyond the shift patterns of the staff around them. This was not, in the end, a fortress in any meaningful strategic sense. It was closer to a tomb built in advance, and the man who occupied it appears, on the evidence of those who served alongside him in its final weeks, to have understood that fact rather earlier than he was prepared to admit to the people depending on him. Understanding how this space was actually built, what its concrete and steel were genuinely capable of withstanding, and what can be reliably documented about its final weeks matters, because the Führerbunker has become one of the most heavily mythologized structures of the 20th century, wrapped in decades of wartime propaganda, Soviet secrecy, and post-war rumor, when the verifiable engineering and documentary record turns out to be, in most respects, stranger and more mundane than the legend that grew up around it. The need for such a structure did not appear suddenly in 1945. It grew out of a problem that had been building since the earliest Allied bombing raids on Berlin began in the late summer of 1940. The Reich's senior leadership had almost nowhere adequate to shelter during a sustained air raid, and the political optics of Hitler visibly retreating underground were, in the regime's own internal thinking, judged nearly as dangerous as the bombs themselves. The first structure on the site, later known as the Führerbunker, was built in 1936 as a temporary air raid shelter beneath the old Reich Chancellery garden, with a roof slab a little under 2 meters thick, adequate protection for the ordnance in use when Europe was still nominally at peace, but hopelessly outmatched by what was to come. By 1943, RAF Bomber Command's night offensive and the American 8th Air Force's daylight raids were delivering attacks of a scale scarcely imaginable a few years earlier, and Albert Speer's own construction ministry was reporting that conventional shelters across Berlin were failing outright under direct hits from the heaviest bombs then entering Allied service. A second, considerably deeper structure, the Führerbunker proper, was authorized in 1943 and completed the following year, sited several meters below the Führerbunker and connected to it by a spiral concrete stairwell. The engineering challenge was not merely to survive an air raid. Berlin's water table sat uncomfortably close to the surface across much of the city center, meaning any deep excavation risked flooding the works before construction was even complete, and the surrounding streets and chancellery buildings remained in daily use throughout, so the whole project had to proceed without undermining the gardens and offices above it. What resulted was not one bunker, but effectively 2, stacked and interconnected, a compromise between what strategic planners wanted and what the ground itself, together with the war's steadily dwindling resources of steel, cement, and skilled labor, actually allowed them to build. Berlin, unlike London, had not been designed with mass underground shelter in mind. The city's civilian population relied heavily on purpose-built above-ground flak towers, enormous reinforced concrete structures at Humboldt-Hain, Friedrichshain, and the zoo, each capable of sheltering many thousands of people behind walls several meters thick, and it was precisely this same construction logic, applied at a far smaller and more discreet scale, that eventually produced the bunker beneath the Chancellery garden. The contrast mattered. A flak tower could be built openly, its scale itself a piece of propaganda broadcasting the regime's resilience to the watching public, whereas a leadership bunker beneath the seat of government had to remain functionally invisible, its true extent hidden from ordinary Berliners for as long as possible, which imposed its own separate set of constraints on how and where it could be expanded. The organization responsible for the design and construction was the same body behind most of the Reich's hardened structures elsewhere. Engineers operating under Organization Taut, the state construction agency that had already built the Atlantic Wall's coastal defenses and the reinforced U-boat pens along the French Biscay coast, structures whose surviving concrete still defies conventional demolition today. The Führerbunker's roof consisted of reinforced concrete roughly 3 meters thick across its most heavily protected sections, poured over a dense lattice of steel reinforcing bar, a slab whose mass per square meter was broadly comparable to the armored flight deck of a contemporary battleship, though considerably less sophisticated in its metallurgy. The walls were similarly reinforced, if less uniformly than some post-war propaganda accounts later claimed, and the complex as a whole occupied a modest footprint of somewhere in the region of 250 square meters across roughly 30 small partitioned rooms, a space smaller than many suburban houses despite sheltering, at its most crowded point in April 1945, several dozen staff, adjutants, secretaries, guards, and eventually entire families. Ventilation was entirely mechanical and had to run continuously, drawing filtered air down through a shaft disguised within the Chancellery garden's ornamental structures, because a space sealed this deeply and this densely populated could not rely on any form of passive airflow. Without the fans running, staff later recalled, the atmosphere would turn stale and uncomfortable within hours, and genuinely unbreathable well before a day had passed. Electricity came from a diesel generator, supplemented for as long as Berlin's municipal grid still functioned, and an emergency water supply was drawn from a well sunk specifically to serve the complex, since the city's mains water became increasingly unreliable as Soviet artillery closed on the capital. A small telephone exchange and a shortwave radio link, staffed continuously by signals troops, represented the only means by which the complex maintained any contact at all with the outside world once landline connections across Berlin began failing under bombardment, a fragile thread that grew steadily less reliable through April 1945. The interior finish, by striking contrast to the scale of the engineering effort, was almost aggressively plain. Cheap linoleum flooring, exposed pipework running along the corridor ceilings, and furnishings shipped down piecemeal from the grander rooms of the Chancellery above, so that the overall effect, by every surviving eyewitness account, was less Nazi lair and rather closer to a cramped, poorly lit municipal basement, an impression somewhat at odds with the very considerable resources required to put 3 meters of reinforced concrete over it in the middle of a collapsing war economy. 2 emergency exit towers connected the lower complex to the surface, one rising from the Führerbunker into the Chancellery garden itself, disguised as an ordinary garden pavilion with a rounded, faintly absurd striped roof that later appeared in Soviet reconnaissance photographs and became, almost by accident, one of the few visually distinctive features of the entire site. The rooms themselves were laid out along a narrow central corridor barely 1.5 meters wide, a conference room where daily military situation briefings were held around a plain map table, a small study and adjoining bedroom used by Hitler himself, a modest sitting room where, in the small hours of April 29, 1945, he married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony witnessed by Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, and a telephone switchboard room staffed around the clock by signals personnel maintaining what contact remained with military units still notionally under Berlin's command. It bears noting, too, that the labor building much of this network of Reich bunkers, though less thoroughly documented for the Chancellery site specifically than for larger projects like the Atlantic Wall, drew on the same forced and conscripted labor force organization Todt relied upon across occupied Europe. a detail frequently omitted from more sensational retellings of the bunker's construction. By April 1945, the bunker had become, in effect, the last functioning node of German central government, however threadbare that government had by then become. Hitler conducted his final military conferences here, several of which are documented through the post-war recollections of surviving staff, including his secretary, Traudl Junge, whose testimony, given independently and years apart from other witnesses, remains one of the principal sources historians rely on for daily life inside the complex, alongside the accounts of valet Heinz Linge and adjutant Otto Gunsche. Their recollections converge, despite being recorded separately and long after the fact, on a striking psychological picture. A headquarters increasingly detached from the reality unfolding on the streets immediately above it, where officers reportedly continued giving situational briefings referencing divisions that had, by that point, already ceased to exist as coherent fighting formations. Josef Goebbels moved his wife Magda and their 6 children into the complex during the final fortnight of the war, and it was here, on April 30th, 1945, that Hitler and his recently married wife, Eva Braun, died by suicide, a sequence of events later reconstructed from forensic evidence recovered by Soviet forces and from the testimony of the small number of bunker occupants who survived to be questioned. The following day, Magda Goebbels killed the couple's 6 children before she and her husband also took their own lives elsewhere in the complex, an episode documented through both physical evidence and surviving witness accounts, though the precise sequence of events inside those particular rooms remains, understandably, one of the more sparsely corroborated details of the bunker's final hours. Exact circumstances surrounding several of these final events remain subject to some genuine documentary uncertainty even 80 years on, in part because Soviet investigators controlled the physical evidence for years afterwards and released information about their findings only selectively throughout the early Cold War. In the days immediately following the suicides, several senior figures attempted to break out of the encircled government quarter on foot, moving in small groups through connecting cellars and shattered streets under Soviet fire. Martin Bormann was among those who left the bunker that night, and his fate remained officially unresolved for decades until remains discovered in Berlin in 1972 were later confirmed through forensic testing to be his. Hitler's birthday on April 20th, 1945, marked by a final subdued gathering of senior Nazi officials inside the complex, even as Soviet artillery had begun striking the government quarter directly, is often cited by historians as the moment the bunker's function shifted decisively from headquarters to shelter of last resort, since almost none of the military options discussed in the days that followed corresponded to forces that could actually be deployed. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing at all. Germany was far from alone in building underground for its leadership's survival, though the results elsewhere varied considerably in scale and philosophy. Hitler's own Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair headquarters complex in East Prussia, was a far larger undertaking, covering some 6.5 square kilometers of forest and eventually incorporating bunkers whose roofs were reinforced to as much as 5 meters of concrete by 1944, purpose-built from the outset to withstand a direct hit rather than adapted piecemeal beneath an existing city garden, as the Berlin complex effectively was. In London, the Cabinet War Rooms beneath Whitehall offered Churchill's War Cabinet comparable underground protection, though built to a rather different brief, a working government headquarters intended for years of continuous operation, initially with only a few meters of reinforced concrete overhead, a limitation addressed later in the war with the addition of a thick reinforced slab, nicknamed simply the slab, once the scale of the bombing threat became clear. In Moscow, Stalin's Soviet leadership relied on an even more extensive philosophy of depth, including a reserve capital bunker constructed at Kuibyshev, now Samara, reaching some 37 meters below ground, considerably deeper than anything built in Berlin, reflecting a Soviet planning assumption that entire government functions, not merely a single leader, might need to relocate hundreds of kilometers from the front rather than simply shelter beneath it. In Washington, no truly comparable complex existed for Roosevelt, since the continental United States faced no remotely equivalent bombing threat during the war, and the modest underground shelter added beneath the east wing of the White House was correspondingly limited in both scale and ambition. Even Imperial Japan pursued a broadly similar strategy late in the war, relocating military command functions into a vast, excavated tunnel complex at Matsushiro, intended, had the war continued, to shelter the emperor and central government from an anticipated Allied invasion of the home islands, a project on which construction never fully finished before Japan's surrender rendered it unnecessary. What distinguishes the Führerbunker from all of these is not any particular engineering sophistication, which was solid but scarcely remarkable by the standards other belligerents were achieving elsewhere, but rather the fact that it was used exactly as its final, desperate purpose implied it might be, as the literal last redoubt of a collapsing state right up to the catastrophic moment its architects had presumably hoped, on some level, never to see realized. The bunker's physical legacy afterwards proved almost anticlimactic, given everything that had happened inside it. Soviet forces, having captured the site in early May 1945, initially preserved elements of the complex for intelligence purposes, extensively photographing and documenting its interior before East German authorities later flattened and buried much of the structure during redevelopment of the area across the 1950s and again in subsequent decades, partly in a deliberate effort to prevent the site becoming a location of neo-Nazi pilgrimage. For decades afterwards, the precise location was left deliberately unmarked on any city map. Only in 2006, ahead of the Football World Cup hosted in Germany that summer, did Berlin's authorities install a small, deliberately low-key information board at the site, which today sits beneath an unremarkable car park and residential courtyard behind apartment blocks near the former Wilhelmstrasse. This studied anti-monumentalism is itself a historically significant choice, reflecting a broader post-war German policy of refusing to create shrines, however unintentional, out of the physical machinery of the Third Reich's final days. What survives instead is almost entirely documentary in nature. Photographs taken by Soviet investigators immediately after Berlin's capture, the post-war testimony of the small number of bunker staff who lived to be formally questioned, and scattered physical fragments recovered from the site over subsequent decades, several of which are now held quietly in German and Russian archives rather than displayed to the public. The bunker's psychological legacy, by contrast, proved considerably larger and longer-lived than its physical one, feeding directly into decades of conspiracy theory about Hitler's supposed escape and survival, theories that gained real traction precisely because early Soviet secrecy left an evidentiary vacuum that rumor, and later popular fiction, was only too willing to fill in its place. 9 meters of Berlin clay and reinforced concrete separated the last headquarters of the Third Reich from the ruined city collapsing above it, and in the end that distance made no difference at all to the outcome either side was fighting for. The bunker had been built, at considerable cost to a war economy already stretched past breaking point, to keep a regime functioning long enough to fight on. Instead, it became the place where that regime, in its final and most private hours, chose to stop. 3 meters of concrete kept out the artillery. It could not keep out the arithmetic of a war already lost, nor could it preserve the fiction, sustained in briefings held meters from where Soviet shells were already falling, that armies still existed to be moved across a map. What remains today, on the surface at least, is a car park, a modest plaque easy to walk past without noticing, and a documentary record painstakingly reassembled from forensic fragments, Soviet photographs, and the recollections of the handful of people who walked out of that spiral stairwell into a Berlin that no longer resembled the one they had entered by only weeks before. The engineering held, in the narrow sense that it did exactly what reinforced concrete of that thickness is supposed to do. The war did not hold. The regime did not hold. And perhaps that is the plainest way to understand what the Führerbunker really was. Not a fortress that failed under bombardment, since it was barely tested that way at all, but a tomb that worked precisely as intended, built by a state that had already, on some level long before the concrete was even poured, stopped believing it would need anything more from the ground beneath Berlin than somewhere final to stand. Nothing about the site today suggests any of this. Visitors walking past the car park on Gertrude Kolmer Strasse see nothing but ordinary post-war apartment.